The hydraulic arm of the Kubota KX40 excavator shuddered as it bit into the dense, rain-soaked clay, sending a heavy, rhythmic vibration up through the floorboards of the cab and straight into the soles of my steel-toed boots. I adjusted the grading laser mounted on the dashboard, watching the digital readout flash a steady, brilliant green against the overcast morning light. Down in the trench, Jameer Parker, my foreman, signaled with a gloved hand, stepping back carefully over the uneven ground as I swung the heavy steel bucket to the left and released a ton of dark earth onto the designated spoil pile. The scent of shattered limestone, turned topsoil, and wet cedar hung thick in the air, a sharp, clean smell that usually settled my mind and gave me a profound sense of order. Today, it wasn't working. I throttled down the diesel engine, wiping a streak of dark grease from my jaw with the back of my wrist, when the sound of raised, sharp voices drifted over the low stone property line. I killed the ignition entirely, the sudden silence rushing in to fill the cab. Through the dense canopy of the heritage oaks separating my current commercial job site from the old Bennett farm next door, I saw a familiar silhouette holding a clipboard. Harlan Morales held the clipboard like a weapon. Gianna's blueprints were rolled tight against her chest. Her shoulders stayed perfectly squared against the cold wind, but her fingers kept tightening around the thick architectural paper until the edges creased visibly under the pressure. Harlan, the president of the newly expanded Heritage Grove HOA, stood on the cracked concrete of the adjacent driveway, pointing a rigid finger at the woman who looked like she hadn't slept a full hour since the moving truck departed. Gianna bought the farm exactly 8 days ago. She spent the first week clearing brush. The citation arrived the very first day she disturbed the soil line. Today was day 2 of the HOA's 14-day cure period. Harlan didn't care about her attempt to stop running from city to city and put permanent roots down. He wanted to enforce a strict 14-day cure or quit notice, followed by a punitive lien vote on day 14, to force a quick sale to his developer buddies who had been eyeing the historical lot for years. And if that massive heritage oak went down to satisfy his strict paving rules, the sudden grade change would flood my job site next door with runoff water, meaning my crew would lose weeks of scheduled work. I had a practical, measurable reason to step in before I had any personal one. Property values, Harlan said, his voice carrying over the wet grass like a harsh siren. Non-compliance. Daily fines of $500 starting on day 14? Gianna Bennett stood her ground on the top step of her porch, refusing to yield the high ground. She wore a faded denim jacket and work boots that were entirely too clean for the mud she was standing over, her dark hair pulled back in a messy knot that was already coming undone in the damp breeze. She told Harlan, keeping her voice completely level, that the root system of the massive tree in the front yard couldn't just be paved over to meet a community sidewalk requirement without completely destroying the structural integrity of the soil and killing the canopy. Harlan simply sneered, tapping his clipboard with a silver pen, dismissing her logic outright. I dropped down from the excavator, grabbing my heavy aluminum transit-level tripod from the truck bed purely out of professional habit, and started walking toward the property line. I ducked under the sagging branches of the oak, stepping onto her cracked driveway with a heavy, deliberate thud of my boots. "Harlan," I said, pitching my voice low and calm, letting it cut cleanly through his ongoing lecture. He stopped mid-sentence, turning fast to face me. Gianna blinked, her posture shifting slightly as I stepped up beside her. I stayed close enough to block the harsh morning wind coming off the street, but I kept a respectful 2 feet of distance between us, ensuring I wasn't crowding her space. "Andrew," Harlan replied, his tone instantly recalibrating to something far more cautious. He knew I handled the high-end landscaping for half the board members in this subdivision, and he knew my firm's reputation. "This doesn't concern your firm. Miss Bennett here is in violation of Ordinance 4A. Unauthorized earth exposure and a hazard to the community sidewalk grid." The 14-day clock started ticking yesterday. I looked down at the bright yellow citation he was trying to press into her hand. I looked at Gianna. Up close, the sheer exhaustion around her dark eyes was undeniable. But there was a sharp, intelligent defiance in the way she held her jaw. She didn't look at me for a rescue. She looked at me calculating the new geometry of the conversation, assessing my angle. "The ordinance specifies unauthorized," I said, keeping my focus strictly on Harlan while gesturing broadly to the massive, sprawling roots of the heritage oak that broke through the topsoil. "But any structural interference within the critical root zone of a 200-year-old Quercus virginiana requires a master arborist assessment before the HOA can mandate paving. You know that, Harlan. We wrote that exception into the bylaws last year." Harlan's face tightened, his jaw working as he processed the intervention. He looked between me and Gianna, realizing his easy intimidation tactic had just hit a wall of technical expertise he couldn't talk his way over. He shoved the yellow citation back under the metal clip of his board with a sharp snap. 14 days, Andrew. If that yard isn't graded and compliant, the board will vote on the lien on day 14. We don't do exceptions for eyesores, historic or otherwise. He turned on his heel and marched down the driveway, getting into his pristine silver sedan. I watched his taillights disappear down the street before I turned to the woman standing beside me. A sudden, heavy silence settled over the yard, broken only by the steady drip of condensation from the oak leaves hitting the puddles below. "You didn't have to do that," Gianna said, her voice completely flat, guarding her relief. She unrolled the blueprint slightly, her eyes tracing the chaotic, overgrown contour lines of her property. "I don't like owing favors to neighbors I haven't even met yet." I rested my hands casually on the top of the transit-level tripod, keeping my posture relaxed so she wouldn't feel cornered. "I'm Andrew Thompson. I run the landscape architecture firm handling the grading next door. And you don't owe me a favor." Harlan uses those citations as a shakedown. He forces new buyers into a panic, so they hire his brother-in-law's paving company to fix the imaginary problem. Or they sell the lot in frustration. Gianna looked up, her gaze steady and highly analytical. "I'm Gianna. I'm an architectural drafter." She gestured to the chaotic yard with the rolled paper, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. "I thought I could handle the restoration myself. I didn't factor in a homeowners association acting like a neighborhood racket." I walked over and crouched by the massive root flare of the oak tree, pulling a heavy carpenter's pencil from my chest pocket. I dragged the thick graphite lead along the damp soil line, visually measuring the slope, and marked 2 distinct anchor points on the corner of her blueprint, where the paper hung over the wood railing. "Today is day 2, I said, standing back up and brushing the dirt from my knees. "We need to install a tiered retaining wall using permeable block. It protects the oak's root system, manages the water runoff correctly, and falls under the historical beautification clause, which completely bypasses Ordinance 4A. I flipped to a blank grid page in my small notebook, sketched a quick, rough schematic of her front yard, mapping a step-by-step plan with specific dates and material loads, and handed the paper to her. "Here is the timeline. Here are the tasks. If we start tomorrow, we beat the deadline." Gianna stared at the paper, reading the calculated yardage, then looked up at me, a deep hesitation pooling in her eyes. "I can't afford a firm like yours, Andrew. And I don't sign contracts I can't uphold." I didn't push. I stepped back to my side of the low stone fence and waited, burying my hands deep in my pockets, giving her the physical and mental space to decide. "The plan is yours, Gianna, free of charge. If you need heavy machinery, you know where to find me." By the late afternoon of day 2, the Texas weather had shifted aggressively, filling the space with heavy, humid air that made every breath feel like drawing warm water into the lungs. I was calibrating a laser measure on the adjacent commercial lot when I heard the grinding, terrible sound of metal gears stripping. I looked over the low stone fence line. Gianna had rented a small, battered mini excavator from a local hardware store. She was sitting in the open cab, wrestling with the dual joysticks, trying to drag a load of wet clay away from the oak tree to start the foundation trench. The machine lurched violently, the track spinning in the thick mud, digging a deeper rut that threatened to destabilize the very roots she was trying to save. My chest tightened immediately. My flaw, the one Jameer pointed out weakly, was the instinct to rush over, shut the machine down, and take the controls out of someone's hands to fix the problem myself. I hopped the low stone wall and walked onto her property, my boots sinking into the ruts she had just carved. I stepped up onto the metal track of the excavator, resting my hand on the cold steel frame near the door, intentionally keeping my hands far away from the ignition key so I wouldn't overstep her authority on her own equipment. "Cut the engine, Gianna. You're going to snap the hydraulic line," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the deafening roar of the struggling diesel engine. She let go of the joysticks and slapped her hand hard against the steering column, her eyes blazing with a sudden, fierce independence. "Back off, Andrew," she snapped over the noise, her jaw set. "I told you I am perfectly capable of figuring this out." I froze. I realized instantly my tone had crossed a line, sounding exactly like a boss reprimanding a rookie rather than a neighbor offering a mechanical hand. "You're right. I said, my voice dropping back to a calm, measured tone that the engine noise nearly swallowed. I apologize. It's your property. I shouldn't have crowded you. I stepped down from the metal tracks, putting immediate physical distance between us. I didn't leave, though. I stood by the oak tree and watched her struggle for another 10 minutes. The machine kept bogging down in the dense clay, the engine whining in protest. Finally, with a frustrated, heavy sigh, she killed the engine herself and dropped her forehead against her hands, resting them heavily on the controls. The left track isn't catching, she admitted quietly, not looking up from her hands. I walked over to the back of the rented machine. I didn't offer unsolicited advice or explain the mechanics. I knelt down in the mud, pulled a heavy steel wrench from my tool belt, and tightened the tensioner valve on the left track that the rental company had clearly neglected to calibrate before renting it out. Try it now, I said, standing up and wiping my greasy hands on a blue cotton rag. She turned the key. The machine rumbled to life, and as she engaged the joysticks, it moved smoothly forward, the heavy rubber gripping the earth without slipping or grinding. She looked down at me from the cab, the thick defensiveness in her eyes fracturing just a little bit. "Thank you," she said, the words genuine and quiet. I nodded, keeping my hands secured in my pockets to stop myself from doing anything else. "The clay here is incredibly dense," I offered, keeping the conversation strictly technical and focused on the job. "You have to take shallow cuts. Don't try to move the earth all at once. Skim it." She adjusted her grip on the joysticks, her posture straightening. "Shallow cuts," she repeated. I watched her work for another hour, offering a simple hand signal here and there to guide the bucket's depth, a quiet, productive rhythm establishing itself over the roar of the diesel engine. The rhythm held over the next week, settling into a pattern of intense, focused labor. Jameer, seeing the timeline on the board, quietly covered my commercial crew next door during the late afternoons so I could run the heavy skid steer for Gianna right before dusk. We were moving massive, rectangular limestone blocks for the retaining wall, coordinating perfectly without having to shout over the engines. She handled the precise architectural measurements with her transit level, shooting the grades and marking the string lines, and I provided the horsepower to drop the stone exactly where she pointed. On day 9, a sudden, violent downpour hit just as we opened a vulnerable new section of the trench near the driveway. The water immediately began eroding the exposed soil, threatening to wash away the base layer near the oak's roots. Without a single word of discussion, Gianna grabbed one end of a massive, heavy-duty plastic tarp, and I grabbed the other. We scrambled up the muddy slope in the pouring rain, the clay slicking our boots, driving rebar stakes into the ground with a heavy sledgehammer to secure the plastic and divert the rushing water into the street gutter. When we finally finished, we were both soaked to the bone, catching our breath in sharp, cold pulls, our boots completely caked in thick, white limestone mud. She looked at the secured trench, the water flowing safely away from the roots, then looked at me, swiping wet hair out of her eyes with a muddy glove. She didn't complain about the cold or the ruined clothes. She just nodded, recognizing the exact moment the hazard was contained. By the evening of day 10, the sun was dropping below the tree line, casting long, sharp shadows across the newly structured yard. The air had finally cooled, offering a slight reprieve from the week's humidity. We were sitting on the dropped tailgate of my truck, completely exhausted from setting and leveling the second tier of the heavy limestone wall. I reached into the hard plastic cooler sitting in the truck bed behind us. "I completely forgot to restock," I muttered, looking down into the empty, lukewarm water at the bottom. I pulled out 2 bottles of cold water and one single, slightly crushed granola bar that had survived the week. I handed her a water bottle, then unwrapped the granola bar and broke it exactly in half, holding one piece out to her. She laughed once short in surprise, taking the piece of food from my hand. "Dinner of champions," she said, raising the oats in a mock toast. We sat in companionable silence, eating the crushed food and drinking the cold water. It was a tiny, perfect moment of relief in the middle of a chaotic, exhausting timeline. "You saw the grate on the south corner, right?" I asked, looking out at the wall we were building. It was perfectly level, a testament to her drafting skills and my heavy lifting. She took a long drink, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "It's exactly 3 degrees. Perfect runoff," she said, a small, proud smile touching the corners of her mouth, changing the entire geometry of her tired face. Suddenly, her phone buzzed loudly. vibrating against the metal tailgate between us. She looked down at the bright screen, and I saw her entire posture stiffen, the ease of the moment instantly evaporating. It was an email from her corporate drafting firm. She let out a breath that sounded like pure defeat, rubbing her temple in that exact way I had memorized over the last 10 days whenever she felt cornered. Instead of asking her to explain her stress or offering unsolicited advice, I reached over, picked up her phone, and placed it face down on the cold metal. "You're off the clock, Gianna," I said quietly, looking at the street. "The soil needs to settle. You should, too." She looked at the face-down phone, then at me, her guard dropping. "I'm not good at stopping," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper, blending with the sound of the wind in the oak branches. "I spent the last 10 years moving from city to city, taking drafting contracts, never staying anywhere longer than a 6-month lease. I bought this place to force myself to stay, to build something that belonged to me. But every time Harlan shows up with a threat, or work demands another 60-hour week on a project 3 states away, I just want to pack my car and run." I held her gaze, keeping my own steady, refusing to let her spiral into the panic. "You don't have to run from this," I said. "The foundation we're building right now is solid. It's not going anywhere." I almost reached out to steady her elbow, then I stopped. My fingers twitched toward the damp canvas of her sleeve, but I clenched the cold water bottle harder until my knuckles went white. She kept her breathing steady, not backing away, leaving the quiet promise between us hanging in the evening air. The fragile peace we built shattered on the morning of day 11. I was in my office trailer next door, going over supply manifests and checking invoices, when I heard the heavy, aggressive slam of car doors on the street. I looked out the window. It wasn't just Harlan this time. It was Harlan, 2 other HOA board members holding clipboards, and a man wearing a bright yellow safety vest. It was exactly 3 days before the deadline. They were early, and they were looking for a fight. I grabbed my hard hat and sprinted across the property line, vaulting the low stone wall. By the time I reached the front yard, the man in the vest was unrolling a massive sheet of utility grid blueprints over the hood of Harlan's car. Gianna was standing on her porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face completely pale as she stared at the paper. "Stop work order," Harlan said, his voice dripping with triumphant satisfaction as I approached the group. "Effective immediately. Your little retaining wall project is intersecting a buried county utility setback." Chapter 12, Section 4. You dig another inch, and the city issues a $10,000 fine. I walked past Harlan and looked closely at the man in the vest. He wasn't a city inspector, his boots were clean, and he lacked the municipal badge. He was the HOA's contracted compliance officer, wearing a borrowed piece of neon to look official and intimidate a homeowner. I looked down at the blueprints spread on the hood. The red line marking the utility setback did, in fact, clip the very edge of the trench we had dug yesterday. I tapped the red line on the printout, then flipped to the older overlay Gianna kept on her drafting table, bringing it over and holding both pages side by side on the hood of the car. "This is an outdated grid map," I stated, tracing the discrepancy with my thumb so everyone could see the physical distance between the lines. "The main line was rerouted in 2018 when the subdivision was expanded." The compliance officer shook his head, indifferent to the evidence. "Doesn't matter to me, pal. This is the map on file with the HOA board. Until it's officially contested and redrawn by the county, no digging." Harlan smirked, pulling a bright orange stopwork sticker from his pocket and walking over to slap it aggressively onto the side of Gianna's rented mini excavator. "You're out of time, Miss Bennett. The board votes on the lien on day 14. I know a developer who will buy the lot from you as is, cash offer." When they drove away, the silence left behind was suffocating, thick with the threat of a lost battle. Gianna walked slowly down the wooden porch steps and sat heavily on a stack of limestone blocks we hadn't placed yet. She looked utterly defeated, the fight completely drained from her posture, her hands hanging loosely between her knees. I sat down on the block next to her, intentionally leaving 6 inches of space between us, offering presence without pressure. She shook her head, pulling her knees tightly to her chest, making herself small. "This is exactly why I don't commit to things. As soon as you try to build something permanent, someone with a clipboard proves to you that you don't belong there. I can't do it." She looked at me, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears of pure frustration. "I should just sell to his group. I can't give you everything you want, a perfect neighbor, a success story for your landscaping portfolio. I'm just gonna walk away." I didn't offer a motivational speech. I didn't tell her that everything happened for a reason or that things would magically work out. I stood up, looking down at her, my voice quiet but absolute. I don't need a perfect neighbor, I said, ensuring she heard the finality in my tone. I need you to not sell my favorite piece of land in this county to a tyrant. Give me 24 hours. I turned and walked toward my truck. I had work to do, and it wasn't going to be solved with a shovel. That night, the harsh glow of my laptop screen was the only light in my kitchen. The digital clock on the microwave read 3:14 a.m. I had 36 browser tabs open, logged directly into the county clerk's digital archive, pulling every utility overlay map, meeting minute, and zoning addendum for the Heritage Grove sector dating back to 1985. The house was dead quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the rapid, rhythmic clicking of my mouse as I scrolled through hundreds of pages of legalese. Gianna's text from hours ago saying she was calling a real estate agent in the morning to draft listing papers sat unanswered on my phone. I refused to reply with empty comfort. I was looking for the structural flaw in Harlan's legal argument, and I wasn't going to sleep until I found it. At 4:20 a.m., my eyes burning from the screen glare, I found it. It wasn't just a reroute map. It was a signed, notarized grandfather clause filed during the 2018 subdivision expansion. It explicitly exempted original farm plots from the new utility setback boundaries in exchange for maintaining historical canopy cover, specifically the oaks. Harlan had been on the board when the document was signed. He knew it existed. He had intentionally buried it in the archives to use the setback line as a weapon. I hit print, the machine whirring to life in the quiet house, spitting out pages of dense legal text that proved the trench was entirely lawful. I gathered the heavy stack of documents and drove to the county courthouse in the dark, sitting in my truck until the doors unlocked. The clerk's office opened at 8 a.m. My filing receipt for the recorded exemption and the official notice of contest was time-stamped exactly at 8:07 a.m. I slid the stamped receipt into the front of the file on top so it would be the first thing anyone saw. I wasn't just fixing a yard anymore. I was ending a bully's leverage permanently. Day 14 arrived with the suffocating heat typical of late Texas autumn, baking the streets and pushing everyone indoors. The HOA board meeting was held in the back room of the Sunny Patio Cafe, a local spot owned by Elsie Reed, a woman who had known me since I was a teenager pushing a lawnmower around the neighborhood. The room smelled intensely of dark roast coffee and nervous tension. It was packed with neighbors holding lukewarm cups, watching the spectacle unfold. Harlan sat at the head table with his wooden gavel, looking exceptionally smug, arranging his papers with slow, deliberate movements. Gianna sat in the second row, wearing a sharp, professional blazer, but her hands were clasped so tightly together in her lap that her knuckles were stark white. I stood in the back, leaning casually against the doorframe, my heavy leather satchel slung across my chest. Harlan called the meeting to order, the gavel cracking sharply against the wood. Item 4, he announced loudly, ensuring the whole room heard him. The Bennett property. The stop work order remains in place. Due to massive non-compliance and utility hazard, the board motions to apply a punitive lien. He looked directly at Gianna, offering a fake, sympathetic smile. Unless the owner wishes to announce a sale? Gianna stood up. She looked terrified, the weight of the room pressing down on her, but she didn't look down at the floor. I am not selling, she said, her voice shaking slightly before finding its solid footing. I have followed every safety protocol. The design protects the oak and the grating. Harlan chuckled softly, adjusting his tie as if dealing with a difficult child. Your design violates the utility line, Miss Bennett. The compliance officer confirmed it. The lien is going forward. Actually, Harlan, it doesn't, I said. I pushed off the doorframe and walked slowly down the center aisle. The room went dead quiet. The only sound was the heavy tread of my boots on the hardwood floor. I walked straight to the head table, ignoring the other board members, and dropped the thick file of architectural blueprints and county records onto the wood with a heavy, satisfying thud that echoed in the quiet room. Page 4. I instructed, not raising my voice, forcing him to look down. The 2018 Heritage Exemption Clause. Signed by you. The Bennett property is exempt from the modern setback line because it predates the grid. The trench is 100% lawful, and your stop work order is harassment. Harlan stared at the paperwork, a slow flush of red creeping up his neck as he recognized his own signature on the copy. He leaned forward, lowering his voice so only I and the board members could hear over the murmurs of the crowd starting behind me. "Don't make this political, Andrew," Harlan warned, his voice a low, toxic hiss. "You like winning commercial bids in this neighborhood. Keep your head down, or you'll find your firm locked out of the next phase." My jaw locked. I looked at Harlan, letting him see exactly how little his threat meant to me, then turned my back to him entirely, facing the room of my neighbors. "The documents are officially filed with the county as of this morning," I announced clearly, holding up the time-stamped receipt for anyone in the back to see. "The stop work order is invalid. If the board votes for a lien today, my firm will personally fund the legal petition against the HOA for fraudulent enforcement." The room erupted into noise. Elsie Reed nodded approvingly from the back, crossing her arms and glaring at the board. Harlan slammed his gavel repeatedly, but the power had entirely left the room, evaporating into the coffee-scented air. The other board members were already leaning away from him, whispering furiously, distancing themselves from the liability. Gianna stepped out of her row, moving to stand directly beside me at the front of the room, facing the board. "This is my property," she stated clearly, her voice ringing out over the noise, projecting a boundary she had finally found the courage to draw. "And Andrew Thompson is my lead architect. We finish the build tomorrow." She didn't look at Harlan anymore, she looked at me. It was a public choice, an undeniable alignment. It cost her socially, making an enemy of the board president on day 14 of living there, but the absolute freedom in her posture was undeniable. The board, terrified of a legal audit, quickly moved to dismiss the lien, eager to avoid a messy, public lawsuit that would expose their own paperwork. We walked out of the cafe together, the cool night air hitting us like a wave of pure relief, washing away the tension of the room. The walk back to her property was quiet, the heavy, suffocating pressure of the past 14 days finally draining away into the dark streets. The moon illuminated the massive oak tree and the perfectly level, tiered limestone wall we had built together. Block by block, in the mud and the rain, the soil was stabilized. The hazard was gone. We stopped at the dropped tailgate of my truck. Gianna reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone. She opened her email app, holding the glowing screen up so I could see the drafted message addressed to her corporate firm's regional manager. The text was clear and uncompromising. She was dropping all travel assignments, taking only remote contracts, and establishing a permanent local schedule. She didn't ask for permission, she stated her terms. She hit send. Then, looking directly at me, she deliberately placed the device face down on the cold metal of the tailgate, mirroring the action I had taken days ago. "I'm staying," she said quietly, the words holding the weight of a vow. I walked over to the cab of my truck, grabbing a clipboard with the final county sign-off sheets and a clear, weatherproof document folder. I handed her the pen. She signed her name on the bottom line, her hand perfectly still, the ink dark against the white paper. She didn't hesitate for a second. I nodded once, taking the clipboard back and sliding the papers into the plastic sleeve. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice steady and clear in the quiet night, "we submit the final landscape plan under my name and your firm as the listed contractor." She took the weatherproof folder from my hands, walked up the steps of her porch, and pinned it directly to the center wooden post with a heavy staple gun. The metallic crack was loud, final, and the folder displayed the paperwork right where Harlan would see it the next time he drove by. She had stamped permits and a signed schedule, and she wasn't hiding or running anymore. "You risked a massive commercial contract for me today," she said, turning back to me, standing on the porch step. The defensive armor she had worn since the day we met was completely gone, replaced by a quiet strength. "I told you, I can't give you everything you want. I'm still figuring out how to do this." I walked up to the base of the porch steps. I didn't crowd her space, but I didn't hide the absolute certainty in my posture as I looked up at her. She looked down at me, the moonlight catching the profound relief and trust in her eyes. She took a deliberate step down, crossing the distance I had meticulously maintained. She reached out, her fingers resting lightly on the heavy canvas of my work jacket, right over my chest. It was a concrete choice. A grounding anchor witnessed only by the ancient oak tree and the quiet street. "You already give me more than enough," I answered, my voice a quiet rumble in the night. I placed my hand over hers, holding it steady against my chest. The chaos was gone. The foundation was secure. The end. Closing thoughts. The best foundations aren't loud. They just hold. When someone shows up consistently, you stop packing your bags and realize you don't have to face the hard things alone. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.